Okay, so let's make a start. I think there'll be a few people joining over the next few minutes, but they should be able to catch up. Welcome everyone to our weekly call. Thanks very much for joining. As you can see, and I'll just sort of move over to the next slide. The sort of main theme for the call this week is going to be reinventing the DNS route. I could have gone with re-engineering or revolutionizing, or probably a whole heap of other words. I was going with alliteration, and reinventing the route seemed like a pretty reasonable start. And then, depending on time, we'll cover other stuff, but we'll sort of worry about that if we have time. And this was really driven by a conversation that I had with sort of Geoff over breakfast in Ripe 2 or 3 weeks ago now, whatever it was. And he rather foolishly sort of just posed a sort of rhetorical question about, why do we do the route the way we do? And but Geoff had an eminently sensible alternative proposal, which he's going to share with us in a moment. It seemed reasonable to me, and I thought it was at least worth the conversation to get a sense of if this is worthy of pursuit, or if it's a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I suspect many, if not all of you on the call, will know Geoff. Will have probably bumped into him at various points on a whole range of different conferences somewhere in the world as he seeks to escape from the penal colony, to sort of come to civilization as often as he possibly can, with his sort of data-rich presentations normally. Which I have no idea if this is going to be data-rich or more of a conversation, but I'm sure it will be thought-provoking either way. So you should all know that Geoff is, I think, still chief scientist at APNIC. And had a long-standing relationship with sort of APNIC and the community in Asia in general, as well as the more broadly across sort of the internet community. So without further ado, let me hand over to Geoff to sort of share his thoughts and then hopefully kick off an interesting conversation on the topic of the route. So Geoff, thanks very much for staying up until the early hours, and look forward to you elaborating on your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew, and good afternoon, all. I was just ruminating as I sit here in this rather cold room at night at 1 a.m. in the morning, thinking this time last week I was in Paris enjoying a rather pleasant, early summer day, and thinking, why the hell did I go back to Australia? And the answer really is, I have no idea. But, here I am. And let's sort of move on with what I'd like to share with you today. And that is some personal thoughts about, are we doing the right thing with the root zone of the DNS? And maybe there's some scope for rethinking, particularly the root zone, the way we're delivering it, to try and sort of address some of the, I don't know, emerging anomalies that seem to be appearing in that system. Now, I really should start off with a pretty hefty disclaimer that these thoughts, probably misguided, probably wrong, but they're all mine, right? It's all me. I am a member of a couple of community groups associated with ICANN around the DNS root service. I always like to think it's in sort of some kind of penance of some sins in a previous life or two, of which evidently there are many, because I'm currently the chair of the Root Zone Evolution Review Committee, which is a grand title, but it's really just a gating committee that says, aside from NS records and authority records and glue records in the root zone, who do you ask and who do you need to sort of consider if you want to add something else into the root zone? And evidently the answer is, in some ways, this committee has a few things to say if that was what you wanted to do. And the second thing, and I must have committed some heinous sins in a previous life, because for many years, and I actually failed to remember a life before I was a member of this particular working group, the Root Server Governance Working Group, which I look here, I thought I saw Geoff Osborne. There are a few of us who are also serving our time on this committee. I like to think that, with a convict past, I've certainly, qualified, and maybe the others have a buried convict past as well, because it seems to be the working group without end. It's just been going on and on. But anyway, I bring this up to say certainly that's informed my views as experiences, but they don't reflect the work of those two groups. They are forming their own views about this area, and that's fine. But I'm not representing them. Nothing I say here reflects anything they might be thinking, and you shouldn't take words out of my mouth and pop them in theirs, because that would be just wrong. So, do you need this slide? No, you don't. The root's important. You all know why. I don't need to explain it. You all know that's why you're here. Let's move on. Let's move on to the first thing of substance. Some years ago, the root server, I've forgotten what the second S was, advisory committee decided that they'd add some transparency to the operation of the root service. And that's great. And what they did do was generate statistics about the number of queries seen by each of the 13 root server names day by day. And this is a graph of that data since 2016. Now, each color is a different root letter, and the colors go from the top is A, B, C, all the way through to M. It's lots of pretty colors. A couple of discontinuities where you sort of go, is that the data, or is that the underlying root system where some massive thing has happened? I suspect that a lot of this is data, but there is one that stands out like a shot. That peak there in late 2020, around about 160 billion queries a day, just slightly left before, in December 20, Chrome was using a technique to understand if the Chrome browser had appeared in some kind of DNS hell. And so what it did was it generated single label queries, and the label was, I think, a random alphanumeric of between 7 and 15 characters long, and simply sent it out. Now, if you're in a normal DNS environment where those labels get resolved by the DNS, then the answer was NX domain, obviously. But if you're in an environment that was mucking around and stuffing things in and adding labels or whatever, you would not get NX domain. You get something else. And so these labels were helping Chrome understand what kind of DNS it was dealing with. Now, from Chrome's perspective, and I guess this was back in 2015 or earlier, queries are free. Doesn't matter. But you've got to understand that, if Geoff's favorite browser that's used by Geoff and a couple of his mates does something, nobody's going to notice. But when you've got 70 to 80% of the market share of browsers across the planet and a few billion people using it, one or two queries is not inconsequential. It's massive. And when you stop doing it, it's immediately obvious in the root service that those queries have gone away. And if you look at these sort of the continuity of these various colors, almost the only root letter that didn't see a massive drop in the query traffic to the root was mroot. I have no idea why. I'm not sure anyone does. But the relative drop in query traffic seen by M was lower than the relative drop in query traffic seen by others. And indeed, E and F appeared to see massive drops in the query load as a result of Chrome withdrawing the use of chromoids. That was the first thing. The second thing is actually more of a really big concern. And that's the last 2 years. Because after the chromoid behavior disappeared and various updates across the planet over the next year and a half or so eliminated all residual use of chromoids, they largely have gone away. We were left with a query traffic level that was previously seen back in 2019, about 90 billion queries a day. But it hasn't been stable. Since then, over just 2 years, the daily query rate seen by all of the root servers is now kicking 130 billion queries a day. That's massive. Now, some of you are old enough, I know, because I remember you were there too, when we were seeing explosive growth. It first happened across a number of revolutions in the wired internet, and then when mobiles came along, again, we were seeing this huge pulse in demand surge that we were trying to build infrastructure to cope with. But to be perfectly frank, we put a phone in everyone's pocket. We put a SIM card in every car. We've stuffed internet into almost anything we could possibly stuff it into. We're full. Most of the world's networks are showing signs of market saturation. Growth in address space, tapering off. Autonomous system numbers, tapering off. Bandwidth demands, tapering off. Yeah, there's been a growth in volume over streaming, but even that is stabilizing. What we're seeing is rather than demand pull, we're actually seeing a metric of growth which is more akin to natural population pressures. We're seeing, 3 to maybe 7% growth per year across growth of those metrics, except in root server query volumes. That's odd. That's really odd. You see, I'm old school. I really thought that the root was there when the local recursive resolver caches had kind of expired or weren't working. That the root was only there to prime those recursive resolvers on startup, and once they're running, just simply refresh expired cached entries when they happen to time out. And the root has a relatively long cache. Those entries are not, this expires in 5 minutes from now. It's, oh my God, you can hang on to forever. 2 weeks or something. Whatever, long. So why the growth challenge? If this is all about cache misses and cache renewal, that doesn't explain a 40% growth rate. The DNS hasn't magically kind of grown in volume over that period. Like HTTPS has had its kind of, impact because now 2 queries have become 3. But even so, that's not a big issue. It shouldn't be a 40% growth in root server traffic. So here we are, and we have this growth. Now, the real question, I think, is how do we respond? Now, before I launch into that, let me quickly talk about who pays who. Because the economics of the DNS is, to my mind, one of these weird areas of anomalous anti-gravity. Normally, everywhere else on the planet, if a good is consumed, the consumer pays the producer a fee. And, that dates back to Adam Smith and earlier. I think it dates back to most of organized humanity. Increasing consumption generates more fees, which can fund higher production volumes. The invisible hand of Adam Smith comes into play, and together with competitive pressures, markets behave in rational, stable manners. This is great. If consumers want things, their ability to pay for it induces supply. Supply and demand equilibrate, off we go, that's society. But DNS queries are unfunded. Now you kind of go, is all the DNS unfunded? Nah. ISPs take the cost of their ISP operation, and as part of the service, not only do they deliver your traffic and send you traffic, they also operate their in-house recursive resolvers. And that's all bundled into this access fee. So the DNS as a piece of infrastructure that you're probably using in your local service provider is paid for by you. And no one really pays authoritative servers to answer queries about the domain they serve. Actually, I tell a lie. There are a number of authoritative servers that do charge by the query, They charge, though, they charge the domain names they serve. So authoritative servers are paid to answer queries about the domain they serve by the folk who are actually having their names hosted on those authoritative servers. The DNS recursive resolvers don't sort of have a payment to accompany their query to those servers. Queries are unfunded. And this kind of holds that users pay recursives and names, serve names, pay authoritatives. And that holds for everywhere except the root zone. And to be perfectly frank, nobody, literally nobody, pays for the operation of the root zone. This started back in John Postel's time, where a number of folk were co-opted, coerced, persuaded, whatever, to actually offer a copy of the root zone at their own cost. It was a piece of altruism. And fascinatingly, and I think it's almost now 40 years later, it's been a long time, there's still this tiny corner of hippiedom, of the left-leaning liberal internet there right at the heart of the internet. It says, we do this because we're good people. And I thank them. But it is bizarre because everywhere else is just economics and markets. Now, the root service is super duper critical because without it, nothing else works. And in any market economy, if you're a supplier of a critical resource, you're in a very, very weird position because if you're a monopoly provider, you can extract a monopoly rental and there's no relief from it. There's no alternative because you're the critical resource supplier. And whereas in all other markets, customers can normally go and seek alternatives, if you're a root service provider, oddly enough, you're sitting in a very strange position where relief through competitive offerings isn't really an option. And the conventional answer is, in most other markets, this is why we have regulators and public regulatory frameworks, right? Various forms of market abuse get referred to various operators and, the wheels of the Department of Justice and antitrust actions or whatever the associated response is, roll along with their slow bureaucratic, levels. And, to some extent, the threat of those actions causes some degree of market behavior. And sometimes, you actually go through the full box of bananas and go to the end of a process of antitrust or whatever, as happened with AT&T, I guess. But that doesn't actually happen in the root. Here's a root service function that's universal. Everyone needs to use it. But oddly enough, that altruism is accompanied by a degree of self-imposition. A self-imposition to provide a freely offered service. And considering that we send full domain names, query minimization really hasn't taken much effect in the DNS. We send these servers critical private information in real time at the rate of 130 billion queries a day, and these folk respect that privacy and provide you with answers quickly. And that ethos of operating those 12 independent service operators has been adequate and sufficient. We can't point to market abuse to say there's a problem there. There isn't. It's operating, if you will, according to the ideals that we expected of them 40 years ago. And those ideals haven't changed. They're still doing it and good on them. But 40% is not slight. 40% is a big problem. So can you grow it by another 40% in the next 2 years? And again, and again, and again. And considering no one's paying for this, are you expecting those 12 operators just to continuously scale up and up and up at their cost? This seems like a remarkably difficult ask. In fact, I'm not sure it's a rational ask. And I think it leads us to this next question. How do you scale the root service? How can we build 40% more capacity year on year on year? 2 years on 2 years. How can we do that? There have been a number of exercises, and some of you will aware of them. Some of you probably were part of them over the various years. There was an interesting one by Yeti, if you remember that, and I think I'm going back 10 years, that said 13 is just a number. And you know, in some time, in a long past year, long forgotten, when we were running IPv4 only, 13 was a magic number that you could send back the names and IP addresses of 13 servers inside a priming response that was kept under 512 bytes. So, yay, 13 is a great number. Let's stick to 13. We went to V6, we went to dual stack. The priming response grew to 811 bytes in volume. I can't spell, it's bytes, not byes. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter. The Yeti exercise certainly showed, if it showed anything, that a larger set of root name servers was perfectly feasible. And that even if you told the root server, keep your answer small, and you only got a partial response in terms of root servers and their glue records, things still worked just fine. So in some ways, 13 is just a number, and 14 is just as good as 13 or as bad. You know, there's no magic about that number. And indeed, if you look at the way TLDs operate, only 2 zones in the root, 2, actually have 13 name servers. Dot, the root, and ARPA. Everyone else in the root runs either 6 or 4. I don't know why 5's an evil number. Why is 5 named name servers remarkably uncommon in the root? You know, the number of evil is 5. Weird. But anyway, 6, more popular than 4. Is 13 a necessary number? You know, it isn't. Because quite frankly, most resolvers have a work limit. And if you ask one name server, no answer, another name server, no answer, and you keep on trying, somewhere after about 7 to 10 seconds, and somewhere after about 6 or 7 name servers, the resolver goes, give up, there is no answer, I'm not spending any more time on you, otherwise it'll be a denial of service attack. So quite frankly, 14 doesn't help. It won't add resilience. It won't actually scale the service delivery capability to any appreciable extent. So more named root servers really doesn't give you a handle here. And of course, there's this other elephant in the room that none of us really want to address. Who do you pick, or how do you pick the next operator? A government? A private operator? How do you admit another party to this little, room, to this little cabal? And we've found over the years that that's an impossibly difficult question. Do you say no to a government because they're a government? That's kind of odd considering we're operating a public communications resource. But why one government? Why not the lot? Why not all 225? If Macquarie Island is good enough to attract a US tariff, and I think it did, the poor seals there have now got a 15% tariff imposition. Thank you, United States. We appreciate your concern. Why shouldn't they also have a root name server? Just as illogical. So in some ways, more named root servers is both a practical and a political unanswerable problem. We don't understand how we could possibly answer that question in any realistic way. And it's certainly easier to just go, oh, I'm going to ignore that and move on. So we do. So the other way of doing this is to go, let's just go parallel. Like every other part of computing, once you run out of single line speed, you just put 2 computers, 10, 100, 1,000,000 into the same area and just get them all working at the same time. And this inherent parallelism of Anycast has been enthusiastically embraced by almost everyone in the root service community to varying degrees. Yes, B and G are not as sort of vast as others. And in some ways, operating a large Anycast service is not cheap. And these folk are paying for it themselves. And so these numbers reflect the ability of these root service operators to actually harness and sort of orchestrate resources to do large Anycast operations. And that's not easy. It's also not that efficient. Anycast doesn't evenly balance across all of the 328 services operated by eRoot or 359 by FRoot. It doesn't. Some get much more load than others. But what it does do is it does increase overall system capacity. It does improve to some extent service resilience, but it ain't cheap. And if you want 40% more capacity in 2 years' time, you've got to build it out by another 40%. This doesn't stop. This is not an answer that the existing numbers will scale and handle, double the load. They won't. This just calls for more and more money to be poured into the bucket. So I think I just said all that. Exponential growth is extraordinarily difficult. Now, we've seen in Moore's law that it's extraordinarily beneficial for many. But at the same time, if I spend $1 this year, in 2 years' time, I've got to spend two. In 4 years' time, I've got to spend four. You all know the maths. After 10 years, you're spending 1,000 times the more money. So it can't expand indefinitely. It just can't. And if we don't understand what's driving that growth in root server queries, then we're kind of stuck inside this. And more service platforms in Anycast is not an answer. So let's go to another piece of data that is collected by the root servers. And that is the answers to those queries. Not what they're asking for, but the names, the query names they're asking about. And you can kind of see an artifact of chromoids in around December 2020. This is the proportion of answers served by the root name servers. And this time I haven't stacked them. I've just simply given each root service letter its own linear plot. And the big red is the total across all 12 data points. And said, what proportion of answers are NX domain? Now, we were getting close to 80%. And that's not an achievement. That's a really sad reflection that 80% of the queries across 2020 were going, no, that's not a label. Now, if you think about it, that's actually about right with the theory that the root is there when the local caches aren't working. They're not absorbing it. The local recursive resolvers are seeing random names, and they haven't got them cached because there are infinitely more names that don't exist than there are ones that do, right? So how do you cache the infinite set of names that don't exist? And the answer is you can't. So all that stuff is just shoveled through the root. And at the time, this was pretty weird insofar as if you were lucky enough to having the data of a large recursive resolver, you didn't see 80% of the queries going to the recursive resolver resulting in NX domain. Not at all. I happen to be privy to Cloudflare's data, 1.1.1.1, due to an accident of history. Let's not go there. And they're seeing around 6 to 7% of the queries that they receive to that recursive resolver being answered with NX domain. Really low. But the root at the time was seeing really, really high. Now, we got rid of chromoids, and you can see the result, that those chromoids had a massive impact. And chromoids don't exist, so the NX domain, answer rate fell across 2021 and even across a bit of 2022 because upgrades, who need them? Who needs them? I need to upgrade Chrome. Oh no, tomorrow it'll be fine. So it took some time to flush them. And now, though, we're seeing that most of that stuff has been flushed. The other part of this is we came up with a better way of doing negative caching. And aggressive NSEC caching was indeed, I think, the best possible use of DNSSEC we've come up with so far. And I'll just lay that there and move on. Because what you could do with NX domain is use the same number of entries as there are in the root to describe all the entries that aren't. Because it's a bit like a dictionary. A dictionary has all the words that exist in a language, right? And if you order them alphabetically, you look at the spans between two consecutive words, there are as many spans as there are words. Let's say there are 100,000 words in the English dictionary. With 100,000 spans, You can also describe the billions of words that don't exist because it's just 100,000 spans. That's what's going on with RFC 8198. Bind supports it. Unbound supports it. Not resolvers support it. If you try and do a census of what people actually do out there in recursive resolver land, most of them are doing negative caching, as far as I'm aware. But the queries, the root zone, keep on growing. And in effect, the declining queries that result in NX domain. So in some ways, these are not NX domain-based growth. There's something else going on here that is causing a growth in the root service query load. So the real question is, okay, negative caching was great, but we need more. How can we increase the effectiveness of local caching for negative and positive and reduce that query load being placed on the root name servers? Because, as we've said, 40% compound growth rate over 2 years is not supportable in the long term. This is not a proposition. So along comes something we've known about for decades, which is rather than doing incremental caching to incremental querying to discover a zone's content, why not just cache the lot? It's tiny. I'm like the root zone's 2.2 megabytes. RZERC, thank you, Dwayne Wessels, under his guidance, when he was chair of it, actually came up with, together with work in the IETF, a zone message digest record. So that there's one new entry in the root zone that's appeared a small number of years ago, that said, if you have a key signing key, and you should, here is an entry that says, take the entire root zone you've just received. If this record, the zone MD record, can be validated with the key signing key, you've got a current and authentic copy of the root zone in its entirety. This is brilliant, because once you do that, you don't need to ask anybody about what's in the root zone. All your queries about Geoff's private favorite domain that he doesn't want anyone else to know about, don't get asked to anyone other than your recursive resolver, because it has a copy of the root zone. Stuff doesn't leak. So this was documented, again, it's been documented many, many times as RFC 8806. And it uses AXFR, which is zone transfer over TCP. And it is blindingly simple. Here's a copy of a bind config. I think it's bind 9.14 or later, anything later than that. You just go zone.type mirror done. Wow. Why aren't we all doing it? Because in one query, I don't ask the root server ever again incremental queries. And even if I make the assumption that the zone changes every 24 hours, which I think the authority records say you can cache entries for two days, so 1 day is fine, why not make it the default? Why not go one step further, though? Because AXFR is not the best way of doing this. Over the last 15 years, this industry has managed to substitute caching for cables. The massive investment in content distribution networks has actually managed to take a huge problem of moving data and replicating that data across the planet. We are good at this. We are phenomenally good at this. Why don't we use that investment and serve the root zone the same way? Just simply take the entire root zone and say, here you are, it's just an object in a CDN. Now, we already know that a couple of root servers use the DNS-based services of a CDN provider to augment their own Entercast platform with CDNs, and that's cool. But why not take this one step further, and instead of using DNS TCP AXFR, why don't we simply go, let's just make this a promiscuous Anycast web object. Don't forget Zone MD, you can detect the bad ones, and simply go, well, go to 1.2.3.4, and what you find is a root zone. Anybody, any CDN, maybe every CDN, should simply serve on that address. And if you ask for it, you get back the current copy of the root zone. And if you ask the Dear IANA, the PTI folk, to go, look, why don't you change the root zone every 24 hours and no more frequently. So everyone who's got a copy of this local root zone knows that it's good for 24 hours, and all they need to do is fetch it again. How much would we need to fetch? How many recursive resolvers are out there? 12 million? Let's be generous. 50 million recursive name servers. And I know I'm over the top on that one. We haven't seen that many. 50 million web object fetches every 24 hours. Any CDN would laugh at you going, I don't notice that kind of volume. That is tiny, tiny, tiny. We can do this standing on our head and not even see it. So in some ways, what is a massive problem to the DNS and incremental query loads, to the CDN folk, it is not even visible traffic. It's just an exceptionally minor problem. So you kind of ask, why aren't we there? Most of the blocks in my mind are already in place. We've done 8806. We've done all these steps. We've even put in one-line config points in a number of the recursive resolvers to go, we can do this really simply. What's needed, as far as I can see, is a minor extension to 8806 that says, as well as zone exfer, you can use HTML. You can even use HTTPS if you feel so inclined. It makes no difference. And use that as an alternative. This means that in your priming point, instead of doing an AXFR to get the root zone, you simply do a web fetch, which I'm pretty sure most resolvers would go, oh yeah, it's not hard. I know how to do that. Because it's kind of DNS over TCP all over again. It's basically DNS over HTML. We've got that code. And the second thing you need to do, because evidently the vendors of recursive resolver software are a little bit touchy about freebasing, is write an RFC describing this is a really good default thing to do, and point a number of vendors at it going, you know, you will do the world a massive favor, if you simply say, by default, we fetch the root zone in its entirety and serve from it, and we do so every 24 hours, because the world seems to be able to cope with that. And that relieves the root servers from this weird sort of inexorable growth that's causing us an enormous amount of angst and trouble to try to deal with in a manner that, you know, is quite frankly causing us heartache, and a lot of angst. Now, I know there are a number of folk who live this life as in much more intimate terms than I do on this call. So at this point, I think I've spent long enough making my case, and I will open it back up for discussion and thought. But hopefully it's prompted sort of some thoughts about why are we doing what we're doing, and maybe it's time to jump off this treadmill and think about alternatives. So with that, Andrew, back to you to manage a discussion. And if you put anything in the chat window, I've been talking, I haven't been reading. Thanks.
I think some of the things in the chat you've overtaken. So I'm not going to do what I normally do, which is to scan through the chat, because that would be probably a lot of comments say, oh, you've covered that. So instead, can I ask people starting from now, by all means, raise your virtual hand and you can potentially talk or put something new in the chat. You can cut and paste if you still think it's current to do that. But any reason why we shouldn't, if I go a step further to my comment and deprecate the root and do it the way that Geoff has outlined instead, perhaps. Think of how much we'll save. Think of the dolphins and the whales and well whatnot. But Ralph, it's probably got a more sensible comment on that. So do you want to come in, Ralph?
No, I mean, I fully agree with Geoff. I mean, with the zone MD and INEOSec, it's really irrelevant where you get the root zone content from, because you can validate it. And the more sources you have, the merrier. And so I'm fully in support of it. I mean, the problem with anything on the internet these days is that even if we implement this and the new software or software updates use it, it takes a long time for the old stuff to phase out. But I'm fully in support of that.
Thanks, Ralph. Kurt and Geoff. So Geoff first. Sorry, I'm just looking at the order on my screen. Geoff, do you want to come in?
I do, and I've got to throw in a bunch of caveats to start. I have a bunch of titles and responsibilities that make me professionally involved in way too much of this. So why don't we just say I'm Geoff, I'm the one spelled with a J, and the Geoff with a G and I have had this discussion many times. So to just start, I am basically in sync with everything Geoff is saying, and then I just follow it with a but. And the problem with the but is I'm chair of RSAC for one thing. I'm in my second term. So I get involved with all the political nonsense of this shit at ICANN, and next week in Prague, I'll be neck deep in it. And what I think is one of the biggest problems with the root server system is it has big shiny letters. And everybody out there who wants to have a Ford F-150 or a Maserati or something else goes, I want a root letter. Well, why? The cool kids have root letters. I want a root letter. And I have spent much of the last 2 years telling people, do you recognize how little power there is in being this person? You're taking this fully signed thing you can't do shit with and handing it off. And you know what it does? It doesn't make your wife's credit card go to Podunk, Africa, country somewhere, or the penal colony for Geoff. It literally gives you the country code for a nation. So you're trying to figure out why this phone call is bad, and I'm saying, I'll tell you that's +39. I'm just telling you where to find where .com has its actual information. We are so removed from anything useful, but the problem is every nation on earth that doesn't have a root server instance wants one. Why? Because same reason I want tanks, F-16s, and nuclear power. So the overwhelming problem is what Geoff is recommending, if we were all still geeks in a room, and if John Postal had lived and we decided we were doing this in 1998, we'd just do it. But the political thing is insane. There are now 12 organizations independently doing something for free that they think works really well, and they just want to make sure somebody doesn't come along and go, give me that, let me screw with it. It's like, no, this is my Tagamotchi I've had for 37 years. No, explain to me why you're not going to mess this up. So I hope that's fair, Geoff. I really enjoyed the presentation. I never saw that 40% increase thing. Let's talk. Are you in Prague?
No, I won't be in Prague. I flew back to Australia and I'm stuck here for a month or so. But
Okay.
the 40% is RSAC 002 data, and that's the thing. It's our data that I'm basing this on. And
Okay.
that's the kind of disturbing thing.
So, okay, because not to tie this whole thing up with my
Yeah.
input, but the other thing I'm skeptical about is that root server volume follows the volume of internet stuff. And there are just a lot of reasons it's not true. Streaming still requires, you basically get recursive servers that are bigger and bigger and bigger. They don't require more fetches they don't require more of anything of the root server system. And, the fact that something's video or streaming or whatever, that doesn't mean it has to stop and more often query the root. So the 40 surprises me. I thought it was a lot flatter. Anyway, great presentation, Geoff. I'm with you.
Thank you.
Kurt.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
It was actually me starting the discussion on the table in Lisbon, was it, right? 90. And I thought it would even further distribute the resilience or increase resilience and improve performance. But we will get lose all the statistics on the root servers for sure. That's a problem if you have it everywhere served. So it will convert the root server operators rather to content providers for the root zone itself. But nevertheless, it's the most important zone. So I think we should really try to establish some kind of showcase and present some benefits that is everybody clear that if it's supported, what will be the effect after it, because it will improve the system. That's my personal strong opinion on it.
Yeah, fair point. I think on that, Geoff, you put your Huston.
Yeah, I put myself here just to kind of clarify a few things. I'm not suggesting replace A with B. I'm not. like the chromoids, there was an initial drop, but then a whole bunch of folk take a few years to upgrade Chrome to its current version and stop doing it. Anything on the scale of the internet takes years. The first step is to actually go, can we serve the root zone in a different way and allow folk to use it if they want in a way that doesn't use incremental queries? And 8806 is an answer, but it kind of keeps on tying up the same servers, this time with TCP. And I was just suggesting, why don't we bring in the awesome power of CDN capability? And there is a massive overhang of capability in CDNs, and simply go, the root zone's an object, knock yourself out. And the amount of delta between DNS over HTTPS and fetching an HTTP web object and using it as a root zone, the code delta is, I think, a couple of lines of code somewhere inside those systems. It's not a big deal. It is really not a big deal. The next bit, which is a bigger deal, as Vicky Risk already noted, is going to, I've made it really easy. It's now the default. You need to turn it off. And I admit that's a big step, but it's not a step for the root server people. It's actually a step for the recursive resolver folk. And the real question is, how do you improve the privacy and performance of your recursive resolver? By loading up once every 24 hours a 2.2 megabyte object. By doing that one action regularly, you get rid of all the rest of these crap queries that all of us have to shovel through for that recursive resolver. There is immediate benefit to you if you do that. There is a side benefit that other folk that have to shovel through the shit you're generating and sending it off to random root servers. That's great. But the real benefit is yourself. And so by advocating the default, I'm not saying this is all the common interest and you suffer. By advocating this being the default, the answer is it works better for you. It's in your interest to use this as a default, no one else's. It's a purely selfish thing. And no, it's not going to happen overnight. But in pointing a direction that gets us out of, we need bigger root server systems to answer incremental queries, is just not going to give us an answer in the fullness of time. It just becomes a problem. And I'm suggesting that maybe we should explore alternatives before it all blows up in our face and gets all icky and sticky. So that was the point I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thanks, Geoff. Eric, did you want to come in?
Yeah, this is a local root all over again, and it's I'm surprised it hasn't been implemented more because it would serve so many more appropriately than this whole centralized system, that somewhat decentralized centralized system that we continue to maintain. That root file compresses down to a megabyte, so it's not even two. You can you can fit a lot less. It does not solve the problem of all these domains that are served by the registries. So all these TLDs and effective TLDs still have zillions of domains. So you still have some observability as to what's out there, which is important for me because I like collecting passive DNS and making it available for people. But we need to think a little bit more about how to inform people about how to get this root. An example, there is an IP address and a file name. Well, that's pretty darn static. If we I think like pool.ntp.org might be a good example of just say, hey, let's just say there's a whole bunch of places where you can get this resource, and automate the heck out of it through enabling it in the recursives. So yeah, great idea. Look forward to seeing this go forward.
Thanks, Eric. So at the moment, I've only really noted the possible measurement question as a possible downside, but we'll comment in the chat whether it's useful data, but we can maybe reflect on that. But Ross, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so to be clear on where I stand with this, I'm not opposed to it. I think it's actually a good thing. I think the one thing, and I think this kind of goes to Vicky's comment, is unfortunately a lot of people that are running recursive resolvers for enterprises don't have any idea what they're doing. And so I don't think they would necessarily understand the behavior change or how to get there, or even fully understand the benefit to them. I think that would be the kind of the challenge in rolling it out in a more rapid pace than would actually happen. I think unfortunately, as Geoff said, it takes a long time in the internet, and I think one of the biggest problems is that we don't have a really great industry-wide large group of people running DNS servers, and unfortunately, I think we have fewer of them being created than are aging out of the system from a working perspective. So I think that will be a challenge, but I do think it's a good idea. I'm not opposed to doing local routes. I think the question is, how do we get to that as the default?
Yeah.
And educate the people that really aren't fully educated but are yet responsible for running those systems. And usually in the enterprise space, the people in the service provider world obviously know exactly what they're doing, and most of the people that we interact with. But I think there are a lot of people, a lot of the customers that I deal with are network guys that were just kind of thrown the DNS and said, here, you deal with this, and weren't provided any training or education on how to deal with that.
I wonder if that declining skills base is a reason in itself for trying to do this, but taking your point about
it could be. Yeah, it could be for sure. Thanks.
Let me give the last comment or question to Carsten. I'm just sort of keeping an eye on the clock in the corner.
Yeah, thank you. Just a brief comment to what Ross had just said, as in how to change the behavior of resolver software is possibly like just doing it that very way. Change the default behavior of the resolver software, as in have this implemented like right from the beginning by those folks who would do this, the resolver software, whatever it is concretely. And you have actively to say reconfigure or deconfigure this kind of like lookup or caching mechanism that has been spoken about, and then I guess possibly that could be the way forward, or at least one way forward. And I'm happy to take like fire for that, but yeah, that just came to my mind. Thank you.
So, Carsten, Geoff, did you want a sort of closing comment? No one should.
No, look, I think this is not the big thing that it's made out to be, that most of the building blocks are already there. The only difference is moving away from AXFR and actually still bringing the root servers into the loop, going, give me a copy of the root zone, into saying ZoneMD is there for a purpose. When something is signed, you know it's authentic and current, even if you found it in the gutter. And the gutter that I'm talking about here is the sewerage pit of the CDN world. We've built and invested billions of dollars in having this massive system. Why not, freeload across it and just dump the root into that system going 1.2.3.4, you can serve it too. I don't care. It's signed. If you're serving a bad copy, it's obvious that you are. And in some ways, it puts the pressure back onto the recursive resolver folk to think about what's in the interests of the people who are using that software. And if you really think speed, efficiency, reliability, and privacy are big keywords, then incrementally asking these other 12 servers all your private secrets is not commensurate with speed, privacy, so on and so forth. In some ways, the user's interests are served by actually doing this subtly differently. So, I put that out there. And the real pressure, I think, is on us to actually document a practice that says, I don't have to do it incrementally querying anymore. If we do this as a best current practice kind of document, then maybe the recursive resolver vendors have something to point to, saying, we're changing the default behavior because this is why. And maybe that's the best thing we could do. Thanks anyway.
What a great comment to finish on. Okay, well, I hope that's as anticipated, that's provoked some thoughts, which I think we need to come back to. As Phil, I think, is still on the call. Maybe this will be a topic that could feature on the next OARC meeting potentially. I'll just throw that out there. Maybe a thought for Phil and Kathy from the program committee to contemplate a sort of discussion to continue this. Geoff, brilliant. As always, plenty of data. I won't have time to go through the normal news headlines. I just wanted to highlight plenty of interesting stuff that's happened over the last week that you can read at your leisure. I'll share the slides after the call, as always. A good piece from Adam Networks, from David, who's on the call, about unmasking ECH, which you can read at your leisure. Interesting panel coming up next week, hosted by Domain Tools. But with people from other places who you'll recognise. Well worth registering for that if you're not caught up in all the fun at ICANN. Good piece from Geoff on Deleg if you're not caught up on that, so worth doing. And then the other one I just wanted to briefly highlight was as we got ICANN sort of running next week, Michael, I think is also on the call, had sort of penned a, if you like, a teaser for something that's coming up later. It's about whether there's a fundamental problem with the multi-staker model as it's been engendered into ICANN. So he's sort of linked to a couple of pieces, but with some sort of further thoughts to come over the coming months. Maybe we'll cover that on this call in due course. And I think that was pretty much it. Plenty of other things happening, but we won't have time for that. A couple of deadlines. If you want to present at Net UK, the replacement for UK NOF, you've got to the end of today to submit your abstracts. And similarly, you got to the end of today, UTC, if you want to get the super early rate for ITF 123 in Madrid next month. After end of today, it bumps up by a couple $100 or so. So do bear those in mind. That's pretty much it because we're on the hour. So next week, I hope we'll be talking about whether zero trust DNS is really the answer we've all been searching for. But I'm just waiting to confirm that. So as soon as I can, I'll push out a note to let you know if we're doing that. So Geoff, appreciate you getting up or staying up into the early hours to share that. And fantastic as always. And I think we're going to have some interesting follow-up discussions, whether it's at ICANN, hopefully at OARC, and no doubt other places too. So look forward to people's comments over the coming weeks, whether we should deprecate the root and move to root 2. And on that cheery note, have a fantastic week, everyone, and catch up same time next week. See you all then. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. You too. Thanks.
Thanks all. Bye.